In the shadowed valleys where the earth's breath grows thin and the stars press down like indifferent judges, there exists a forgotten enclave named Ebon Ridge, nestled against the spine of mountains that have witnessed the slow erosion of countless eras. It was here, in the year when the great comet scarred the sky like a vein of forgotten blood, that Elias Thorne began to unravel the fragile veil of purpose that cloaked his existence. Elias was a cartographer by trade, mapping the contours of lands that no one dared traverse. But his true labor was in charting the invisible terrains of the mind, where questions festered like unseen wounds. At first, his inquiries were solitary whispers in the dim light of his study, surrounded by tomes that spoke of ancient voids and the hollow core of all striving. He pondered the weight of days that piled upon one another without direction, each action a futile echo in an endless cavern. Why persist in the charade of meaning, he asked the silence, when the universe offered only the cold mechanics of decay? These thoughts, once contained, began to leak into his interactions, subtle at first. A pause in conversation, a distant gaze during communal gatherings where the townsfolk recited their rote affirmations of order and continuity. Ebon Ridge was a place bound by unspoken covenants, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tolling of the iron bell in the central spire, summoning all to affirm their roles in the grand illusion of coherence. The inhabitants clung to rituals that warded off the encroaching chaos. The daily ledger of deeds, the evening confessions of doubts, purged before they could take root, the annual convergence where each soul reaffirmed its tether to the collective fabric. To question this was to invite the fracture, for the town knew that one loose thread could unravel the entire weave, exposing the naked absurdity beneath. Elias's wife, Mira, was the embodiment of this fragile equilibrium. She tended the hearth with meticulous devotion, her hands weaving patterns in dough and thread that mirrored the town's insistence on perpetual creation. Yet, as Elias's musings deepened, she sensed the shift, a chill in his touch, words unspoken that hung heavy in the air between them. She lay awake in the nights, listening to the creak of his chair as he stared into the fire, his eyes reflecting not warmth but the yawning emptiness beyond. Mira loved him in the way one clings to a crumbling ledge, fearing the fall more than the strain. It was inevitable that his secret would summon companions. In the quiet hours after the bells toll, Elias drew to him three souls adrift in their own quiet desperations. Lyra, the herbalist whose potions masked the pains of existence but could not cure its futility. Thorne's apprentice, Garin, whose youth burned with unchanneled fire, and the elder scribe, Vesper, whose quill had inscribed too many hollow histories. They gathered in the concealed alcove beneath the old mill, where the river's murmur drowned their voices. There, Elias shared his revelations, not as doctrine, but as a shared descent into the truth that all pursuits were but distractions from the inevitable dissolution. He spoke of the spiral, how each life circled the drain of oblivion, drawing tighter with every revolution, the illusions of progress and connection mere eddies in the flow. Lyra found solace in this, her mixtures taking on a darker hue as she contemplated aiding the weary in hastening their release. Garin, inflamed, saw in it a call to shatter the facades, though Elias urged restraint. Vesper nodded, his scripts now laced with subtle underminings of the town's lore. Their meetings became a ritual of their own, a counterpoint to the spire's summons, binding them in a web of mutual recognition that the world was a vast, uncaring mechanism grinding souls to dust. Myra's discovery came not through confrontation, but through the insidious creep of awareness. She found fragments, notes scrawled in Elias's hand, speaking of the great unmooring, the liberation in acknowledging the void. At first, she dismissed them as fevered dreams, but as the pieces accumulated, the horror settled in her bones. Her husband was not merely troubled. He was the harbinger of dissolution, threatening to infect the town with the poison of ultimate indifference. In Ebon Ridge, such thoughts were not mere heresy. They were the unraveling force that could turn the communal tapestry to tatters, leaving each soul adrift in isolation. The pressure built within her, a psychological vice tightening with each shared meal, where Elias's silence screamed louder than words. She envisioned the consequences, the bell's toll ceasing, neighbors turning inward, the mountains swallowing the town in apathy. Myra's rage was not born of betrayal alone, but of the existential theft. Elias had stolen the fragile scaffold that held her world aloft. In the dead of night, she composed her missive to the custodians, the shadowy council that enforced the covenants, detailing the gatherings, the ideas that eroded the foundations of endurance. The custodians moved with the inevitability of glacial ice. They summoned Elias at dawn, their faces masked in the hoods of tradition, their voices a monotone chant that echoed the town's dread of chaos. He was led to the spire's underchamber, a labyrinth of stone where confessions were extracted not through pain, but through relentless mirroring of one's inner fractures. There, they confronted him with Myra's words, laying bare the extent of his influence. Elias felt the weight of it, not just his own descent, but the dragging down of those he had touched. The trial was no spectacle of shouts, but a subdued ritual in the central hall, with the townsfolk assembled under the dim flicker of lanterns shaped like grasping claws. Myra testified in a voice steady as the river's flow, recounting the notes, the absences, the chill that had invaded their home. She spoke not of anger, but of the creeping dread that Elias's truths would strip away the veils, leaving all exposed to the raw indifference of existence. The custodians nodded, their judgments etched in the lines of their brows, affirming that such inquiries were the ultimate subversion, for they dissolved the bonds that made suffering bearable. Lyra, Garin, and Vesper were chained in the shadows, their faces pale masks of resignation. They were not permitted speech. Their guilt was inferred from association, their fates sealed by the need to prune the infection. Elias was forced to gaze upon them as the sentence was intoned, a vigil of isolation, where he would be bound in the spire's apex, exposed to the elements and the endless sky, compelled to recite the covenants hour upon hour, his voice a broken echo until the illusions reformed or his spirit shattered. But the true horror unfolded in layers, spiraling deeper. For 3 cycles of the moon's waning, Elias was perched atop the spire, his wrists bound to iron rings that bit into flesh with each gust of wind. The townsfolk below continued their rhythms, but their eyes lifted occasionally, witnessing his silhouette against the void. At midday, the custodians ascended, not with whips, but with mirrors, polished surfaces that reflected his own hollowed eyes, forcing him to confront the futility he had preached, now turned inward. See the spiral in yourself. They chanted, their words weaving into his thoughts like invasive roots. Myra attended each ascension, standing at the base, her presence a silent accusation. She watched as Elias's recitations faltered, his voice cracking under the weight of enforced affirmation. The psychological erosion was meticulous, doubts amplified, truths twisted into mockeries, until the boundary between his revelations and the town's delusions blurred into a nauseating haze. He begged not for release, but for the clarity of oblivion, yet none was granted. The dread deepened as he realized the void was not liberating, but an infinite mirror of his own entrapment. On the final day, as the comet's tail faded from the heavens, Lyra, Garin, and Vesper were brought forth. Elias, weakened but aware, was lowered to witness from his bonds. The execution was no swift drop, but a slow immersion into the mountain's chasm, a fissure known as the Whispering Maw, where legends spoke of echoes that never died. One by one, they were lowered on ropes, their cries absorbed into the depths, symbolizing the eternal fall into meaninglessness they had courted. Lyra went first, her herbs scattered like futile offerings, her final whisper a curse on the illusions that bound them all. Garin struggled, his fire extinguished in the cold grip of inevitability, his shouts rebounding as mocking laughter from the stones. Vesper descended silently, his eyes locked on Elias, conveying not blame, but a shared acknowledgement of the cosmic jest. Elias watched, the guilt coiling within him like a serpent devouring its tail, understanding that his quest for truth had birthed this cascade of annihilation. The town resumed its tolling, the bell a monotonous affirmation of continuity, but the air hung heavier, laced with the unspoken knowledge that the spiral persisted. Elias was released, a husk wandering the valleys, his maps now blank parchments reflecting the emptiness he had unearthed. Mira returned to her hearth, her hands mechanical in their motions, but her eyes betrayed the fracture. Having orchestrated the preservation of order, she now glimpsed the void it concealed. Generations passed. The comet returned in cycles, each appearance stirring faint recollections in Ebbenridge's annals. Historians, probing the spire's archives, unearthed the records, the missives, the rituals, the names etched in fading ink. They pondered the persistence of such enforcements, how societies erect barriers against the abyss, only to perpetuate the dread they fear. Yet, in their analyses, they missed the deeper current, the unchanging pulse of human frailty, where the pursuit of meaning collides with the terror of its absence, birthing cruelties that echo through time. In distant eras, when mountains crumble to dust and stars dim, the same patterns endure. The quiet questioner, the vigilant guardian, the bound witnesses, the inexorable descent. No enlightenment banishes this. Progress is but another veil. The universe watches, indifferent, as souls spiral into the maw, their struggles mere ripples in the eternal void. And in Ebbenridge, or whatever shadows replace it, the bell tolls on, a hollow knell for the unending charade, in the hollow years that followed the comet's fade. The town of Erelith clung to its rituals with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. The iron bell still rang at precise intervals, its tone now carrying an almost imperceptible tremor, as though the metal itself had begun to remember what it had witnessed. No one spoke of the alcove beneath the mill anymore. The river had been redirected slightly, its course altered so that the water no longer brushed the stones where confessions once whispered. The change was subtle, practical, explained as flood prevention. Yet everyone understood it was erasure. The one who had once been Elias Thorne no longer answered to that name. He had become a figure referred to only in circumlocutions. The wanderer, the quiet one, the shadow on the ridge. He lived in a lean-to of salvaged timber and canvas on the outermost slope, far enough that the bell's toll reached him as a faint, indifferent pulse. His maps, once meticulous, had been abandoned to mildew and wind. In their place he kept a single ledger, its pages filled not with coordinates, but with dates and durations. How long the sky remained cloudless, how many hours passed between the first bird call and the last, how many breaths he could count before the next tolling began. Measurement had become his only tether, a frail arithmetic against the sensation that time itself was beginning to slip sideways. The town did not exile him formally. Exile would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have meant admitting that something had been severed. Instead, they practiced a quieter violence. Averted eyes when his silhouette appeared against the ridge at dusk, children taught to turn their heads when a shadow crossed a doorway, conversations that paused and resumed in lower tones whenever his name drifted too close to the surface. He was permitted to descend for provisions once every 7th day. A small crate was left at the edge of the lower pasture. Dried grain, a wedge of hard cheese, a clay jug of water. No note, no greeting. The transaction was wordless, mechanical, a ritual of mutual avoidance. Yet the silence was never complete. At irregular intervals, usually in the hour before dawn when fog thickened the valleys, someone would leave an offering at the base of his ridge. A single candle stub, half-burned, a knotted cord of braided hair, a shard of mirror wrapped in cloth. Never the same person twice, never at a predictable time. The objects arrived like messages from a language no one remembered how to speak. Elias never acknowledged them openly, but he kept each one, arranged in careful rows inside the ledger's cover. Over months the collection grew. Bone fragments polished smooth, feathers bound with twine, a rusted key whose lock no longer existed. They were not gifts. They were questions without punctuation. Mira remained in the house at the center of Aerolith. She had not aged so much as condensed, her movements slower, her gaze sharper, as though grief and rage had distilled into something crystalline and cutting. She still tended the hearth, still wove patterns whose symmetry no longer comforted. The townsfolk treated her with the deference owed to a survivor of plague. They brought her firewood without being asked, left baskets of early apples on her step, spoke to her in lowered voices as though volume might reopen old wounds. She accepted their kindness without warmth. Kindness, she had learned, was merely another form of distance. One winter, when ice sealed the river and the bell's clapper froze mid-swing, Mira walked the long path to the ridge. She carried nothing but the black shawl she had worn the night the custodians descended. The wind tore at its edges. Elias watched her approach from the doorway of his shelter. He did not move to meet her, nor did he retreat. They stood separated by 20 paces of frozen earth. She spoke first. "You still count." He inclined his head. "You still breathe," she said. "That is the same thing." He made no reply. She took one step closer. "I thought destruction would bring relief. I thought certainty would follow. Instead, there is only continuation. The same hours, the same faces, the same bell. I preserved the order, and now the order preserves me. Like an insect trapped in amber." Elias looked past her toward the town below, where smoke rose in thin, obedient columns. "You wanted the truth known," he said quietly. "It is known, not in words, in the silences between words, in a way no one looks too long at the alcove, in the way children are taught to turn away. The truth is not spoken here anymore. It is performed." Myra's mouth tightened. "And you?" she asked. "What do you perform?" "I wait," he answered, "for the moment when counting becomes pointless, when the next breath does not arrive. Until then, I measure the waiting." She stared at him for a long time. The wind moved between them like an uninvited third presence. "I hate you still," she said, "but the hate has grown tired. It no longer keeps me warm." She turned and began the descent. Halfway down the slope she paused, looked back once. He had not moved. She continued walking. Years folded into one another. The comet returned twice more, each passage dimmer than the last. The bell cracked along one seam. Its tone acquired a permanent flatness, a morning note no smith could repair. Some said the crack appeared the night Mira stopped leaving food at the lower pasture. Others claimed it had always been there, only now audible. Elias's ledger thickened. The rows of objects lengthened. Occasionally he would descend in darkness, place one of the offerings at the edge of the town's outermost field, then withdraw before first light. No one ever claimed them. They accumulated slowly, a mute archive of unanswered questions. One spring, after a thaw that came too suddenly and too violently, the river rose and tore through the mill. The alcove collapsed inward. Stone and timber vanished beneath brown water. When the flood receded, nothing remained but a smooth scar of mud and a few splintered beams. The town rebuilt the mill higher up the bank. No one mentioned the alcove. No one needed to. Elias watched from the ridge as the new structure rose. He added a date to the ledger. He did not write what it signified. Mira died in the autumn of the following year. She slipped away in her sleep, the hearth cold, the patterns unfinished. The townsfolk buried her beneath the oldest oak, the one whose roots had once grown near the original mill. They spoke of her courage, her sacrifice, her devotion to order. At the graveside someone placed a single candle stub, half-burned. No one remarked on it. Elias did not attend. He remained on the ridge, counting the hours until the sun reached its zenith, then counting again until it touched the horizon. The ledger was nearly full. Soon he would begin a second. The bell tolled on, its cracked voice spreading across the valley like a rumor no one could quite disprove. Somewhere in the ledger's final pages, Elias wrote, "There is no end to the counting, only longer and longer intervals between the realization that nothing was ever being counted." He closed the book. He placed it beside the row of offerings. He stepped outside. The ridge stretched empty before him. The town lay quiet below. The sky pressed down, vast and disinterested. He began to walk, not toward the town, not away from it, simply forward, into the next measure of nothing. In the measureless expanse where footsteps dissolve into the earth's indifferent memory. The wanderer who had shed the name Elias moved without destination, each stride a concession to the mechanical persistence of motion. The ridge gave way to fractured plains, where stones jutted like the exposed bones of forgotten beasts, and the wind carried fragments of sound that might have been echoes from Aerolith or merely the planet's own weary exhalations. He carried no provisions, no map, only the ledger's weight in his mind, a catalog of intervals that now unraveled, threads pulling loose as the act of measurement revealed its own futility. Why count when the increments between voids were themselves voids? The question looped inward, a serpent coiling tighter without end. As days blurred into an undifferentiated haze, he encountered remnants of other existences, abandoned homesteads where doors hung askew, admitting nothing but dust, rusted implements half buried in soil that refused to yield life, faint trails etched by predecessors who had similarly sought the horizon's false promise. These were not discoveries, but confirmations, each one underscoring the universal drift toward erasure. He paused at one such ruin, a collapsed tower that might once have served as a sentinel against the encroaching wilds. Inside, walls bore scratches, crude tallies, perhaps counts of days or losses, mirroring his own abandoned ledger. He traced them with a finger, feeling the grooves as extensions of his unraveling thoughts. Humanity's compulsion to impose order on the chaos, only to watch the order dissolve into deeper disarray. The spiral deepened. Nights brought visions not of rest, but of amplification, where the town's bell resonated in his skull, its cracked tone multiplying into a chorus of dissonant knells. In these hours, figures emerged from the gloom, shadows that wore the faces of Lyra, Gurin, Vesper, their eyes hollowed, not with accusation, but with the same indifferent gaze as the stars overhead. They spoke in unison, voices blending into a murmur. You sought the unmooring, and now the current carries all. He responded not with words, but with continued motion, rising before dawn to press onward, as if distance could dilute the psychological sediment accumulating in his core. Yet with each league, the weight intensified, a psychic gravity pulling him toward the realization that escape was merely another illusion, a deferral of the inevitable convergence with nothingness. Farther afield, the landscape warped into canyons whose depths whispered of ancient collapses, chasms that swallowed light and sound alike. He descended into one, the walls closing him like the narrowing confines of a mind besieged by its own inquiries. Here, the air grew stagnant, laced with the scent of mineral decay, and the path twisted in ways that defied linear progression. Echoes played tricks. His footfalls returned distorted, stretched into elongated sighs that suggested companionship where none existed. In this labyrinth, thoughts spiraled further, questions of agency dissolving into queries about the nature of volition itself. Had he chosen this exile, or had the town's silent rejection scripted it? Was Myra's orchestration a singular act, or merely the manifestation of a collective dread that permeated every society, binding souls in chains of mutual surveillance? Emerging from the canyon after what felt like epochs compressed into hours, he found a vast plateau where the sky dominated, an oppressive canopy that seemed to lower with each breath. Storms gathered here without warning, rains that pounded the earth into submission, mirroring the internal tempest that eroded his remaining fragments of self. During one such deluge, he sheltered beneath an overhang, water cascading like the relentless flow of time's indifference. Memories surfaced unbidden, the alcove's dim light, the shared whispers that had promised liberation but delivered only amplified isolation. Myra's final ascent to the ridge, her words a blade that severed without killing. The horror lay not in the events, but in their perpetual reverberation, a psychological echo chamber where guilt and insight intertwined, each feeding the other in an endless loop. As the plateau gave way to denser forests, where trees interlocked branches in a canopy that blocked all but slivers of light, the wanderer's pace slowed. Roots tripped him, thorns drew blood that went unnoticed, and the undergrowth whispered of entanglements that mirrored the mind's own snares. He began to encounter signs of life, not vibrant, but decayed, animal carcasses picked clean, their bones arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement, though by what hand remained unclear. These tableaus evoked the town's rituals, the enforced affirmations now stripped to their skeletal essence. He pondered the animal impulse toward survival, how it persisted even as awareness of its pointlessness dawned. In humans, this manifested as elaborate deceptions, societies built on covenants, hearths tended with feigned purpose. Yet the undercurrent remained, a dread of the void that drove ever more intricate evasions. Deeper in the woods, solitude fractured. Voices drifted from unseen sources, perhaps travelers, perhaps hallucinations born of exhaustion. He avoided them, circling wide, but their fragments infiltrated, snippets of conversation about lost paths, fading stars, the inexorable pull toward dissolution. One night, camped in a clearing where moonlight pierced the canopy like accusatory fingers, he overheard a group nearby. They spoke in hushed tones of a distant settlement, one that had abandoned bells and covenants in favor of silent acceptance. "They count nothing," one voice said. "They simply endure until endurance fails." The wanderer listened, unmoving, as the words coiled into his thoughts, amplifying the spiral. Was this a mirror of his own trajectory, or another trap, a false haven that would only deepen the descent? The forest thinned eventually, opening on a barren waste where wind sculpted dunes into ephemeral shapes. Here, the physical toll mounted, skin cracked, vision blurred, breaths labored in the arid air. Yet the psychological pressure intensified, thoughts collapsing inward like stars imploding under their own mass. He contemplated the universality of this unraveling. Every soul, regardless of station, circled the same drain, their illusions varying only in complexity. Myra's preservation of order was no victory, but a postponement. The custodian's enforcements not justice, but desperation. His own revelations not enlightenment, but a catalyst for broader erosion. The dread resided in the inescapability, the way existence demanded participation in its own absurdity, punishing those who glimpsed the farce. In this wasteland, offerings appeared again, not placed by hands, but unearthed by shifting sands, a weathered bone, a shard of reflective stone, a coil of frayed rope. He collected them mechanically, adding to an invisible ledger that now existed only in fragmented recall. Each item evoked spirals within spirals. The bone a reminder of corporeal transience, the shard a distorted reflection of self, the rope a symbol of bindings that persisted beyond physical chains. The accumulation weighed without substance, a mental burden that slowed his steps further, drawing him toward stasis. As horizons blurred into uniformity, the wanderer halted at the edge of a great sinkhole, its maw yawning like the chasm that had claimed his companions. Peering in, he saw not darkness, but multiplicity, reflections of ridges, towns, forests, all converging in infinite regression. The wind rose, carrying the faint, cracked toll of a bell that might have been memory or mirage. He stood there, the spiral complete yet unending, thoughts dissolving into the recognition that all paths led here, to the brink where motion ceased and the next measure revealed itself as eternal suspension. The sky lowered further, pressing with the weight of uncountable voids. The earth waited below, patient and unyielding. He lingered, neither advancing nor retreating, suspended in the heavy, unresolved. The wanderer stood at the lip of the sinkhole until the last sliver of light bled from the sky. No final revelation arrived. No voice rose from the depths to absolve or condemn. Only the slow settling of dust, the faint metallic taste of wind-scoured stone, and the knowledge that even this pause, this suspended instant between one breath and the next, was already dissolving. He did not step forward. He did not step back. Instead, the body, that stubborn animal remnant, simply relinquished its upright posture. The knees buckled without ceremony. The palms met the cracked earth. Then the forearms, the chest, the cheek against grit still warm from sun that no longer cared. Gravity completed what Will had long since abandoned. From that position, face to the ground, limbs splayed like a marionette whose strings had finally rotted through, he heard the last tolling. Not the cracked bell of Aerolith. Not memory. Something older, deeper, carried on vibrations too low for ears to register as sound. A pulse that had been running beneath every footfall, every ledger entry, every ritual affirmation since the first creature crawled from water and opened its eyes to a world that offered no explanation. The pulse did not quicken. It did not slow. It simply continued, indifferent to whether anyone remained to count it. Above him the sky had gone the color of old lead. Stars appeared one by one, cold and precise, each a needle point marking the same vast puncture. They did not watch. They did not wait. They simply were, points of fusion burning through inconceivable distances, exhausting themselves without audience or purpose. Beneath him the earth was patient. It accepted the weight without comment. It would accept decomposition without hurry. Bones would bleach. Sinew would dry to thread. Eventually, even the ledger of intervals would flake apart, pages scattering like ash until nothing legible remained. Somewhere far behind, in the valley he had left, the cracked bell would still be striking its flattened note at the appointed hours. Children would still be taught to turn their heads from certain shadows. Hearts would still be tended. Patterns would still be woven. Myra's grave would still lie under the oldest oak, a candle stub long since melted into a gray smear beside the stone. The town would continue performing its continuity, each participant convinced that the performance was what kept the void at bay. None of it reached him now. The pulse kept running. A final breath entered, shallow, unremarkable. A final breath left. After that, there was no longer anyone to distinguish between inhalation and exhalation, between presence and absence, between the numbered interval and the uncountable silence that had always surrounded it. The sinkhole waited, open-mouthed, unblinking. Wind moved across the plateau, erasing footprints that had never mattered. Night settled thicker than cloth, and the spiral, having completed every revolution, did not stop. It simply became indistinguishable from stillness. There was no end. There was only the place where counting finally grew tired of pretending it had ever begun. The earth closed over the shape that had once walked and asked questions. The stars continued their indifferent arithmetic. The pulse ran on, beneath everything. Unheard, unending, unmoved.